"That's not a cabin. That's a mistake in plain sight." The words spread through the small Montana town before Evelyn Carter even finished tightening the last bolt on the strange dome-shaped structure rising on the edge of the frozen field, where wind cut across the land like a warning nobody wanted to hear. And yet she stood there at 68 years old, gloves worn thin, eyes steady, watching the Quonset-style steel shell take shape beside her husband Robert Carter, 71, a retired mechanical technician, who had spent his life fixing systems people claimed could not be fixed, and now together they were building something the entire town had already decided to laugh at. Neighbors slowed their trucks just to stare, some shaking their heads, others openly calling it a metal igloo or a retirement fantasy gone wrong. But what no one saw was the reason behind every decision, every measurement. Every late-night sketch spread across their kitchen table because Evelyn and Robert were not building for approval. They were building for survival, for winters that had once drained their savings and left their old house impossible to maintain, and for a future where heating bills no longer dictated how they lived. Still, the criticism grew louder each day as the dome rose higher, its curved frame reflecting the gray Montana sky like a silent challenge. And Evelyn could feel it in the way former acquaintances avoided eye contact at the grocery store, in the way contractors refused to call back, in the quiet assumption that two retirees had finally lost touch with reality. Yet Robert never argued, never defended it publicly, only adjusted blueprints, tested insulation layers, and measured temperature shifts inside the unfinished shell, as if each number told a story the town refused to read. One afternoon, as a cold front rolled in earlier than expected and frost began forming on the steel ribs, a group of neighbors gathered at a distance, laughing softly at first, then louder as if humor could erase curiosity. But Evelyn simply tightened her coat and stepped inside the unfinished cabin where the air was already noticeably different, still, enclosed, holding warmth in a way the open land never did. And for a brief moment she allowed herself to imagine what it would feel like when it was complete, when the ridicule outside would no longer matter because the truth would be inside the walls, quietly waiting, and Robert, standing beside her with a thermometer in hand, only nodded once and said they were closer than anyone realized, though neither of them yet understood just how much that quiet structure would soon change everything the town thought it knew about them. As the days stretched deeper into the Montana fall, the structure that once looked like a strange idea began to rise into something impossible to ignore, its curved steel frame now fully visible against the wide, open land. And with every passing week the laughter from the town grew sharper, as if repetition alone could prove them right. Yet Evelyn Carter continued arriving at the site every morning at exactly 8 o'clock, her boots crunching over frost-hardened ground, her breath visible in the cold air, while Robert Carter moved with quiet precision inside the partially enclosed shell, measuring angles, checking seals, and adjusting insulation layers that he refused to call finished until they behaved exactly as intended, because in his mind this was not just construction, it was a system that had to survive conditions most homes in the region were never designed to handle. The neighbors watched from a distance, often slowing their vehicles just enough to comment, sometimes laughing openly about how a retired couple had decided to build a spaceship instead of a house. And those words reached Evelyn more than she admitted, especially on evenings when she sat inside their temporary trailer reviewing heating costs from their previous home, remembering winters when utility bills climbed past $500 a month and still never felt enough to keep the cold out. Yet, even in doubt, she never asked Robert to stop, because she could see something in the way he worked, a focus that suggested he was building toward a result others had not yet imagined. By mid-October, the Quonset structure had become fully recognizable, its smooth curved exterior reflecting pale sunlight in the mornings and turning dull gray under heavy clouds, while inside, the transformation was already underway, with layers of modern insulation materials being installed in sections, each one tested carefully before the next was added. And Robert began recording temperature differences every evening, comparing the inside air to the rapidly dropping outdoor readings, though he shared little of those numbers with anyone, not even Evelyn at first, until one night when the first real cold front of the season arrived earlier than predicted and the wind pressed hard against the metal skin of the structure like an uninvited force testing its limits. That evening, a small group of townspeople gathered again at the edge of the property, their voices carrying faintly across the field as they joked about how long it would be before the metal cabin gave in to winter. But what they did not notice was that Evelyn and Robert had already moved inside for a controlled test, closing the final access panels and allowing the interior space to stabilize. And as Robert placed a digital thermometer on a central support beam, he quietly observed the numbers begin to settle in a way that made him pause longer than expected, because despite the freezing air outside, the interior temperature held steady with almost no fluctuation, something he had calculated might be possible but had never fully trusted until now. Evelyn watched his expression carefully, reading the subtle shift in his confidence. And for the first time since construction began, she allowed herself to feel something closer to certainty than doubt, though neither of them spoke it aloud, because outside, the town continued to laugh without knowing that the foundation of their assumptions was already beginning to weaken, one quiet measurement at a time. By the time November settled over the Montana countryside, the conversations in town had shifted from simple jokes into something more persistent, as if the strange structure on the edge of the field had become a topic no one could fully ignore, and Evelyn Carter could feel that shift even without hearing every word, because the way people looked at her in the grocery store had changed, lingering a second longer than necessary before turning away, while Robert Carter continued his routine as if none of it mattered, arriving at the site early each morning with the same quiet discipline, checking seals, adjusting insulation panels, and recording temperatures that now showed a pattern neither of them could ignore. Because every night, the interior of the Quonset structure held warmth far longer than any temporary heater they used should have been capable of sustaining. Yet outside that reality, the town had begun building its own version of the story, one that grew more confident with each passing day, and it reached Evelyn through indirect comments rather than direct confrontation. A cashier mentioning how some projects are just expensive mistakes, or a neighbor at the post office laughing softly about retirement experiments that will not survive December, and although she never responded, those remarks settled heavily in her thoughts during quiet evenings when she reviewed their budget and compared it to what they had spent so far, because even with Robert's careful planning, every material purchase, every insulation upgrade, and every unexpected delay carried a cost that made the project feel fragile in ways numbers alone could not fully describe. Still, what troubled her more than money was the growing pressure of expectation, because Robert's quiet confidence had started to shift into something more focused, almost analytical, as if he was waiting for a specific environmental condition rather than simply building toward completion. And that became clear one morning when he asked her to join him inside the structure during an early cold snap, the kind of temperature drop that brought frost across the fields before sunrise and turned breath visible within seconds of stepping outside. And as they entered the cabin together, Evelyn immediately noticed how different the air felt compared to the surrounding environment. Not just warmer, but stable, as if the structure was resisting the natural pull of the cold in a way she could feel in her bones. Robert placed a small digital monitor on a wooden support beam and recorded the external temperature at 12 degrees Fahrenheit while the interior remained nearly 55 degrees higher, a difference so consistent over several hours that he stopped speaking for a long moment, simply observing the numbers as they held steady without fluctuation. And it was in that silence that Evelyn realized this was no longer a simple construction project, but something that challenged what the town believed was possible, though neither of them shared that realization publicly, because outside those insulated walls the narrative remained unchanged, growing even stronger in its dismissal, until one afternoon a local contractor who had previously refused to participate drove slowly past the property, staring longer than before, as if trying to reconcile what he saw with what he had assumed, and Evelyn noticed that hesitation, subtle but unmistakable, because doubt had begun to replace certainty in small pockets of the town's collective judgment, even if no one was yet willing to admit it aloud. And inside the Quonset structure, Robert quietly made another note in his journal, writing down the temperature difference once more, as though preparing for a result that was no longer theoretical but steadily becoming real. The first week of December arrived in Montana with a silence that felt heavier than the snow itself, covering the fields in a pale white layer that stretched all the way to the horizon. and by then the structure on Evelyn Carter and Robert Carter's property no longer looked like a strange experiment, but something permanent, something that had begun to claim its own place in the landscape. Even as the town continued to speak about it with a mix of disbelief and reluctant curiosity, Evelyn noticed the change first in the way the morning air felt when she stepped out of their temporary trailer, because instead of immediate biting cold that once made her shoulders tighten, there was now a strange anticipation in the atmosphere, as if the land itself was reacting differently to the structure they had built, while Robert had become even more precise in his measurements. Spending longer hours inside the Quonset cabin adjusting small details that most people would never notice, such as sealing micro-gaps along the curved steel panels and testing how heat moved across the interior space when outside temperatures dropped below 10 degrees Fahrenheit. Yet outside their work, the town's attitude was beginning to fracture in subtle ways, because although some residents still insisted the project was doomed, others had started slowing their cars when passing the field, not to laugh, but to look, as if trying to understand something they could not yet explain. And that shift reached Evelyn one afternoon at the local supply store when a former critic who had once dismissed their idea now avoided making direct jokes, and instead asked carefully whether the structure was actually holding up in this cold. A question that lingered with her longer than expected because it marked the first time doubt had begun to turn inward on the people who once laughed the loudest. Inside the cabin itself, Robert set up a more structured testing routine, placing multiple temperature sensors at different heights and distances within the space, recording readings every hour as the storm outside intensified. And what he found began to confirm a pattern that even he had not fully expected, because while outside temperatures fell steadily to single digits, the interior consistently remained stable, maintaining a difference that defied the typical performance of similar structures in the region. Evelyn often joined him during these tests, sitting quietly on a simple wooden bench as she watched him write in his notebook, and she could see how the data was slowly changing something in him, not excitement in a loud sense, but a quiet certainty forming layer by layer, the kind that does not need explanation because it is built entirely on observation. One evening, as wind pressed against the exterior shell and snow gathered along its curved sides, Robert pointed to the latest readings and said nothing for several seconds, allowing the numbers to speak for themselves, and Evelyn realized in that moment that they were no longer trying to prove anything to the town, because what they had built was already proving itself in silence, while outside, unaware of the shift happening behind those insulated walls. The same town that once laughed was beginning to watch a little more closely, as if waiting for the moment when the truth would finally become too visible to ignore. By mid-December, the Montana winter had fully settled in, turning the open land into a quiet stretch of white and gray that seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction. And yet inside the Quonset structure built by Evelyn Carter and Robert Carter, something unusual had begun to feel normal, as if the rules of the outside world no longer applied in the same way. Because each morning Robert recorded temperature readings that consistently showed a dramatic difference between inside and outside conditions, while Evelyn slowly adjusted to the idea that their work had moved beyond what others believed possible and into something that now demanded attention even from those who once dismissed it completely. The couple continued their routine without interruption, arriving early at the site regardless of weather conditions, and Robert would immediately begin checking the sealed panels, inspecting insulation layers, and documenting performance metrics in a small notebook that had become more detailed with each passing day, while Evelyn handled interior organization, keeping the living space functional and observing how the structure responded during longer cold exposure periods. Outside their property, the town's reaction was no longer uniform, because while some residents still held on to their earlier skepticism, others had begun to quietly reconsider what they thought they understood about the project, especially after several particularly cold nights where word spread that the structure had maintained internal temperatures far above expected levels, though few people spoke about it directly, preferring instead to watch from a distance or slow down briefly when passing by the field. One afternoon, Evelyn went into town to pick up supplies and noticed a difference in how people interacted with her, not overtly friendly, but noticeably more restrained, as if earlier certainty had been replaced with hesitation. And at the checkout counter, a woman who had once made dismissive comments about foolish retirement projects now asked in a careful tone whether the cabin required constant heating or if it somehow retained warmth naturally. A question that Evelyn answered briefly without exaggeration, but which stayed with her long after she left the store because it marked a shift in perception that could not be ignored. Meanwhile, Robert continued refining their internal systems, focusing on reducing thermal loss and improving air circulation within. The curved steel design, and during one particularly cold night when temperatures outside dropped into the single digits, he conducted a full overnight test, placing sensors at floor level, mid-height, and near the ceiling to observe how heat distributed itself across the interior space. And what he recorded confirmed a level of consistency that exceeded even his cautious expectations. Because instead of sharp drops in temperature during the night cycle, the interior remained stable with only minimal fluctuation, suggesting that the structure was retaining heat far more efficiently than conventional builds in the region. Evelyn observed him during these tests, noting how his focus had shifted from experimentation to confirmation, as if each new reading was no longer surprising, but instead reinforcing a pattern that was becoming undeniable. And although neither of them spoke about the town's earlier ridicule, it was clear that something had changed in the dynamic between their work and the outside world, because what had once been viewed as an odd construction was now becoming a quiet point of curiosity, drawing occasional visitors who stopped at the edge of the property not to laugh, but simply to look. And inside the warm, curved space of the cabin, Robert finally closed his notebook one evening and said nothing for a long moment, not because there was doubt, but because the numbers had begun to speak with a clarity that no longer required explanation. While outside, winter continued pressing against the structure without realizing it was no longer testing a theory, but witnessing a result. As January approached in Montana, the winter deepened into a steady, unbroken presence that covered the landscape in layers of silence and frost. And by now the Quonset structure built by Evelyn Carter and Robert Carter had become something the town no longer dismissed so easily, because what had once been a subject of ridicule was slowly turning into a subject of quiet observation and even uncertainty, as more people began noticing that the building behaved differently from anything else in the area during extreme cold. Inside the curved steel walls, the environment had stabilized into a consistent pattern that Robert now monitored with increasing precision, recording not only temperature, but also humidity levels, airflow distribution, and how long retained heat persisted after external temperatures dropped sharply overnight. And each reading continued to reinforce the same conclusion, that the structure was holding warmth in a way that defied the expectations of traditional construction in the region. Evelyn had begun to notice a change in her own routine as well, because what once felt like constant evaluation and doubt had shifted into something closer to acceptance, not of public opinion, but of the reality they were observing every day. As she moved through the interior space arranging supplies, checking storage areas, and observing how stable the environment remained even during prolonged cold exposure outside. Yet despite the growing internal confidence, the outside world remained unpredictable, as the town's earlier laughter had not completely disappeared but had fragmented into different reactions, some people still clinging to skepticism, while others quietly began to ask questions they would not have considered before, often through indirect comments or casual conversations that revealed a growing curiosity about whether the structure was actually functioning as reported. One afternoon, a local contractor who had previously dismissed the project as unrealistic drove slowly past the property again, this time stopping longer than before at the edge of the field, studying the curved exterior as snow collected along its surface. And although he did not approach, his hesitation was noticeable enough that Evelyn observed it from inside the cabin and understood that perception was shifting even among those who once seemed certain. Inside, Robert prepared for another extended cold test, choosing a night when forecasts predicted temperatures would drop below 0 degrees Fahrenheit. And as the storm arrived, he activated multiple monitoring points throughout the structure, documenting how quickly the interior stabilized compared to the rapidly falling exterior conditions. And what he observed reinforced a pattern that had now repeated consistently over several weeks, because even under sustained cold pressure, the internal temperature did not follow expected decline rates, instead maintaining a steady range that suggested highly efficient insulation performance combined with controlled heat retention dynamics. Evelyn sat quietly during part of this process, watching Robert review the data in real time, and she noticed that his expression had changed from analytical focus to something more grounded, as if the results were no longer surprising but instead confirming a reality that had already established itself. Later that evening, as the wind pressed against the outer shell and snow accumulated in soft layers along the ground outside, Robert finally spoke only a few words, not to announce success, but simply to acknowledge consistency. And in that moment, Evelyn understood that their project had crossed an invisible threshold, because it was no longer being tested for possibility, but instead demonstrating performance under conditions that the town itself was still trying to understand. While beyond the field boundary, life continued normally, unaware that something quietly persistent was redefining expectations one measurement at a time. By the time late January settled over Montana, the silence around the Quonset structure was no longer filled with open laughter, but with something far more uncertain, because people in the nearby town had begun to stop speaking about it with confidence, and instead with questions they did not fully know how to answer. And Evelyn Carter could feel that change even without direct conversations, as the atmosphere around her shifted from dismissal to cautious curiosity whenever she entered public spaces, while Robert Carter continued his work with the same steady discipline he had maintained since the beginning, though now his focus had narrowed even further into the internal behavior of the structure under sustained cold conditions. Inside the cabin, the environment had become remarkably stable, and what once felt like experimental testing had turned into structured observation, with Robert tracking performance across multiple cold cycles, comparing night and day fluctuations, and documenting how the insulation system responded not only to temperature drops, but also to prolonged exposure below 0 degrees Fahrenheit. And every dataset continued to confirm a pattern that resisted the assumptions of conventional construction in the region. However, despite the technical success, Evelyn began to notice a different kind of pressure forming, not from outside criticism, but from the weight of what they were discovering, because the structure no longer behaved like a simple home under construction, but like a system that had reached a level of efficiency that even Robert struggled to fully explain without extensive review of the data. One morning, as frost covered the surrounding field in a thick white layer and visibility dropped under a pale winter sky, Evelyn overheard a conversation near a local supply stop where two residents discussed the structure without laughter for the first time, instead speaking in lower tones about how the cabin never seems to lose heat the way it should. And that shift in tone stayed with her longer than expected because it marked a transition from judgment to observation. Meanwhile, Robert had begun expanding his testing protocol, introducing controlled heat retention trials where he measured how quickly internal temperatures changed after simulated external drops. And the results showed a consistency that suggested the structure was not only retaining heat efficiently, but also stabilizing internal conditions in a way that reduced normal thermal fluctuation patterns seen in similar environments. Evelyn often joined him during these tests, sitting quietly while watching the numbers update on the small digital monitors he had installed. And although neither of them spoke much during these moments, there was an unspoken understanding forming between them that what they had built was no longer just a response to financial necessity or environmental challenge, but something that was beginning to stand apart from anything the town had anticipated. Outside, the landscape remained unchanged, with wind moving across the open fields and snow continuing to fall in irregular patterns. But inside the curved steel walls, time felt different in subtle ways, as warmth lingered longer and cold intrusion slowed noticeably compared to every previous winter experience they had known. And it was during one particularly long evening test that Robert finally leaned back from his notes and observed that the system had maintained its internal balance for hours without meaningful deviation, a result that he did not announce with excitement, but instead with quiet recognition, while Evelyn looked toward the insulated walls and understood that whatever the town believed, the structure had already moved beyond speculation and into measurable reality that would eventually be impossible to ignore. By early February, the Montana winter had reached its most unforgiving stage, with long stretches of sub-zero temperatures and heavy snow that muted even the smallest sounds across the open fields. Yet inside the Quonset structure built by Evelyn Carter and Robert Carter, The conditions remained consistently stable in a way that no longer felt like a temporary outcome, but rather a sustained reality they could measure, observe, and rely on. And by now, even Evelyn had stopped thinking of each reading as surprising, instead treating them as part of a growing pattern that confirmed what Robert had been carefully documenting since the beginning. The town, however, had entered a different phase in its perception of the project, because while open ridicule had largely faded, it had been replaced by something quieter and more persistent. A form of cautious attention that appeared whenever someone passed the property and slowed their vehicle just long enough to observe the curved structure. Sitting against the snow-covered landscape, as if trying to reconcile memory with what they were now seeing, Evelyn noticed this shift most clearly during a trip into town when she overheard a conversation between two residents who no longer questioned whether the structure worked, but instead wondered how it worked. And that subtle change in tone stayed with her because it marked the beginning of curiosity replacing certainty. Inside the cabin, Robert had expanded his data collection to include longer duration stability tests, monitoring how the internal environment responded over full 24-hour cycles without intervention, and what he recorded consistently showed minimal temperature fluctuation even when external conditions remained below 0 degrees Fahrenheit for extended periods, a result that he approached not with excitement but with careful analysis, checking and rechecking sensor placement and insulation integrity to ensure accuracy before drawing conclusions. Evelyn, meanwhile, had begun to focus on how the structure influenced daily living conditions, noticing how supplies stored inside remained unaffected by external cold, how surfaces retained a neutral temperature, and how the interior space no longer required constant adjustment to remain comfortable, which gradually changed her understanding of what they had built from a simple shelter into something far more controlled and efficient. One afternoon, during a particularly strong winter storm, a local visitor who had previously expressed skepticism arrived at the edge of the property, but did not laugh or make comments as before, instead standing silently for several minutes while observing the structure as snow accumulated along its curved surface without affecting its visible stability. And although the visitor did not enter, the absence of dismissal spoke louder than any previous criticism. Inside, Robert reviewed the latest data log and noticed that even during peak wind exposure and sustained cold pressure, the internal temperature curve remained nearly flat, showing only slight variation that fell within expected measurement tolerance. And as he compared these results to earlier tests, he realized that the system was not simply performing better than expected, but was consistently maintaining equilibrium under conditions that would typically produce significant heat loss in conventional structures. Evelyn sat beside him during this review, watching the numbers scroll across the screen. And she understood without needing explanation that the project had reached a stage where external opinion no longer defined its value, because what they had created was now being validated continuously through measurable performance. And outside the insulated walls, the same winter that once symbolized doubt and challenge now moved across the land without realizing it had already failed to undermine what stood quietly within its reach. By late February, the Montana winter began its slow transition toward early thaw patterns, yet the land still remained locked under deep cold nights and lingering frost that stretched across every open surface. And inside the Quonset structure built by Evelyn Carter and Robert Carter, the conditions they had carefully engineered continued to hold steady with a reliability that now felt less like experimentation and more like confirmation of a fully functioning system, as Robert maintained his detailed logs of internal temperature stability, energy retention duration, and environmental response rates, each dataset reinforcing what had been building for weeks, that the structure was consistently maintaining interior warmth levels significantly higher than external conditions without noticeable degradation over time. By this point, the town's reaction had shifted into a final stage of acceptance mixed with unresolved curiosity, because while no one openly mocked the project anymore, there was still a visible hesitation whenever the structure came into view, as if people were trying to reconcile their earlier assumptions with the evidence they could no longer ignore. And Evelyn noticed this most clearly during her occasional trips into town, where conversations had changed from doubt to indirect acknowledgement, with questions forming around efficiency, insulation, and how a structure of that design could maintain such stable internal Conditions during prolonged subzero periods. Inside the cabin, Robert conducted what he considered their final extended validation cycle, choosing a continuous multi-day observation period during which no adjustments would be made, allowing the structure to operate under natural external pressure alone. And as the days passed, the internal readings remained remarkably consistent, showing minimal variation even as outside temperatures fluctuated significantly between day and night cycles. And this consistency led Robert to a quiet conclusion that the system had reached a point of equilibrium that no longer required constant intervention to maintain. Evelyn spent much of this time reflecting on the journey that had brought them here, remembering the early days of construction when doubt and criticism were constant companions, and comparing them to the present moment where silence from the town carried more weight than words ever had, because silence now meant recognition without admission. On one of the final nights of testing, a strong cold front moved through the region, bringing sharp winds and rapidly falling temperatures that typically placed extreme stress on residential structures in the area. Yet inside the Quonset cabin, the environment remained stable, and Robert observed the data in real time as the internal temperature held within a narrow and consistent range despite the external drop into deep subzero conditions. And instead of reacting with surprise, he simply recorded the final set of readings and closed his notebook with a sense of completion rather than uncertainty. Evelyn stood beside him in the quiet interior space, looking at the curved steel walls that had once been the subject of ridicule and were now simply part of a proven system. And she understood that what they had built was no longer defined by outside opinion or early skepticism, but by its sustained performance under the harshest conditions the Montana winter could offer. And beyond the structure, the land remained still and cold, unaware that the challenge it had imposed had already been met without resistance, not through confrontation, but through consistency that no longer needed to be questioned.